Welcome to this Mastering the Machine Automation Academy webinar for the 5th of November 2022. The topic today was entrepreneurship in the automation space. Hope you enjoy it. Good morning and welcome to this Mastering the Machine Automation Academy webinar for the 5th of November 2022. Today's topic, I'm going to be talking about entrepreneurship in the automation space. Hope you enjoy it. I'm going to get some of the basics out of the way here. What is Mastering the Machine? This is a webinar that I put on every 2 to 3 weeks associated with the Automation Academy. It is named after a document that I put out in 2013, and I just kind of thought it was a cool name. You can download the document itself. It's almost 10 years old now at automationllc.com or on the Automation Primer, which is my blog. But it's evolved into a training and automation website that includes these webinars. And so you can find Automation Academy at www.automationllc.com/join or /automation-academy. And I'll put that little splash up at the end also. What is the Automation Academy itself? This is a membership site that I do training on, and it's got lots of training videos on it for PLCs, things like that. Some job and aptitude assistance. I'll be showing a little bit of that today. Some topics on systems integration, lots and lots of documents. There's a big library there where you can download things, including some software, things like that. We do have a community with interest groups, and I kind of showed the splash screen for this, right? This logo, IO Central. This is the community that used to be just part of the Automation Academy. And I've opened it up to anybody. And again, at the end of this webinar, I will have the website for that. It's basically just /community. And you can, anybody can join that. So I'm going to start this out by pointing out a podcast that I listen to, the Ken Coleman Show. I listen to it a lot of times on my way to driving to Automation NTH, where I do a couple of weeks a month down there. It's about can be a 45-minute drive. So I listen to the Ken Coleman Show in the morning. And the Ken Coleman Show is a lot of what I based my job and aptitude assistance on in the Automation Academy. And he talks about all kinds of different topics, a lot of times in terms of looking for jobs and things like that. But this particular morning, he just brought up some statistics that I thought were interesting. He said that 70% of Americans say that they would like to own a business someday, but that only 6% of Americans actually own a business full time. So I don't know how accurate this is. I don't know where the statistics came from, but they do pretty good research there. So I tend to believe it, and percentages may be a little off, but they're close. But that brings up a really interesting question. Why don't more people own a business if that's really what they want to do, right? And he talked about lots of different possible reasons why that is. The main reasons that people want to own a business, according to the Ken Coleman Show, was so that people could have more flexibility with their time, right? They don't have to clock in and clock out. They can decide when they work. And also they would have control of their income. They would have more control over what they do, what type of work they're doing. And that's probably true. But he kind of exposed these as possible, maybe myths, right? Flexibility, one of the comments he made is that it sounds like, right, you can work whenever you want to, but the reality is when you're starting, you're probably working all the time. You're basically working weekends, you're hustling, you're trying to get new work, that sort of thing. You're doing lots of extra paperwork that you wouldn't normally have to do if you worked for somebody else. And of course, the income when you start out, a lot of times, unless you're really lucky, is not as high as working for somebody else. So I'm going to be talking about some of those aspects this morning. So business forms in the US, and I've kind of been through most of these. A sole proprietorship is the simplest form of business in the United States. The only thing it really requires is a business license from your local, city hall, something like that. You don't need to get with the state on any of that. When you file your taxes, you will declare all your income that you got from that. But it's the simplest form, and it doesn't require much other than that business license. A partnership is a little more complicated. It's sort of like if a couple of sole proprietors got together and just made an agreement and decided that they wanted to form a partnership. It's got a little more legal consequences to it. Obviously, with a partnership, you could have senior partners and junior partners and that sort of thing. So you would have to make some kind of a legal agreement. Do you have to hire lawyers to do that? No, not necessarily. But if you ever had a conflict, whatever you wrote down as far as your partnership agreement would hold sway in a court of law, and that can cause problems if you wrote it up yourself and you're not, used to writing legal documents. I have never been in a partnership as such, but I did take on a partner when I had my LLC, actually when I had my S Corp back in the 90s, right? I took on a partner in about 2005, and it didn't turn out to be a very good idea for me. The Ken Coleman Show is a kind of subsidiary of the Dave Ramsey Show, and they talk a lot about different forms of business. And Dave Ramsey himself talks against partnerships most of the time because they can cause a lot of problems when, let's say it's a 50-50 partnership and people disagree. How do you break the tie? How do you extricate yourself from a partnership once you get into it, right? If one person were to leave, it would leave the other person kind of in lurch. So people make all kinds of agreements to decide what's going to happen if one of the partners leaves. That can be very complicated and difficult. So again, he recommends against it. LLC. So this is in the United States. This is a form of business, a limited liability company. Limited liability corporation, I believe is the technical name. That's what my company is currently. The reason for doing that is if there is a problem with your company legally, the only thing that someone can come after is your company assets, not your personal assets. So this is a kind of an extra layer of protection. If you were a sole proprietor and you went in and let's say did some contract work on somebody's house and made a big mistake and didn't have insurance, somebody could sue you and they could take your personal assets. So that obviously would not be advantageous. You would have to go fight court cases and everything, whereas a limited liability company, basically the only thing they can do is come after the company itself. Now, you still end up having to have lawyers to fight that, and there are a lot of companies that will make you sign agreements that if there is a problem, that you are personally liable for the problem, whether it's financial damages. Let's say you owe somebody money, they can say, well, you need to sign this piece of paper if we're going to loan you money and guarantee it with your personal assets. And anything that you sign supersedes whatever liability protection you have, right? So, but a limited liability company, if somebody does come after you legally, it protects you somewhat. An S Corp, I don't know what the S stands for. I think it's single corporation or something like that. It's differentiated from a C Corp. The biggest difference that I remember is my first company was Automation Consulting Services, Inc. It It was an incorporated company, and there were some differences with limited liability companies. I had a mentor, actually kind of another partner, Knoll Automation Systems. Tom Knoll made his company an LLC, and he built machines, and it protected him again from people suing him for his personal assets. I decided to go with an S Corp, partially because my wife was going to be a part owner of it, and I might bring in other partners. What an S Corp allows you to do, an S Corp or a C Corp, is issue shares in your company. So you can basically have stock on a large scale. Of course, that's corporate stock. On a small scale, that's just shares that somebody would, basically take ownership of part of the assets of your company. They might invest in you, something like that. So, S Corps are usually smaller than C Corps. They only usually have a few members, but they allow you to divide the company up in ways that you can't really do with a partnership, right? And so they're also protected in the same way that LLCs are and C Corps. If you get sued, somebody can come after the company assets, but they have a harder time going after the personal assets of the people involved, unless, again, people sign agreements, which often happens, right? As an individual proprietor or an LLC or something, some company may have you sign an agreement where if you don't pay or if you don't perform, we can come after your personal assets. So you have to be careful about that. But S Corps and C Corps, generally a little bit larger companies. As I mentioned, my current company, LLC, my previous company was an S Corp. The biggest difference, I actually pay a pretty good fee to the state for an LLC. I think I pay $300 and some odd a year just to be an LLC, and I have to renew it every year and submit a report. The S Corp, I also had to submit a report, but it was significantly cheaper. It was also through the state. Some companies decide that they want to incorporate their company in another state, right? And there are tax advantages to that. The other difference that I remember between an S Corp and a C Corp is C Corps can retain earnings. In other words, you can keep some of the money that you make, the profit that you make, and you don't have to pay taxes on it that year. And you can just kind of hold it. Whereas in an S Corp or an LLC, any money that the LLC or the S Corp makes, or for that matter, sole proprietorship partnerships, flows completely through the company to the individuals. There is no way to retain the earnings, even in the S Corp. So that got a little bit complicated. If I made extra money one year, I like the idea that, hey, I could put this money aside, hide it from taxes, keep it under the corporation, and then invest it maybe a couple years later in something. Well, that isn't possible with an S Corp or an LLC. So you have to pay the taxes on it. It flows right through and becomes income. And then you can do whatever you want with the money, put it in a bank or whatever. So that's a little bit about the business forms in the US. I know that overseas they have, limited and things like that. And I believe they equate to some of these different forms, but different laws, you'll have to check on those laws in your particular country. Okay, things to think about when starting a business. And these are all, it's interesting. I started my first business. I'm 62 right now, and I started my first business when I was 36. I had actually kind of started some, halfway businesses before, but never really started a full business until then. And I did just about everything wrong when I started that business. So I'll be filling in on some of those mistakes that you don't want to make. And a lot of these things, licensing, permits, planning, protection, right? What legal form are you going to take? Are you going to be an LLC or an S Corp or a C Corp, whatever? What kind of insurance do you need to know? I knew none of that. And I did start my business in the garage, of the house that I owned. And I probably should have stayed in the garage for a lot longer. But I really didn't plan things out. I just kind of winged it. I was mad at the company I worked for, and I decided to just leave and go out on my own. I wasn't making a lot of money at that company. I was in a kind of a sales and integration role, and wasn't making any commission. So I just decided to go out on my own without much of a plan. You really should, right, plan things, of course, before you jump out on your own. Now, the question that I sometimes get when I do mentor people is, do you need a business plan? What is a business plan? I've written a couple of business plans in the past. They were both for my previous company, which was the S Corp, and they were necessary for banks and for investors, right? People wanted to see forecasts of your income. What was your main purpose as a business going to be? What was your income going to come from? What were your expenses? And there are forms. I used some kind of a form. It was in the 90s. And I used a commercial form. I believe I bought it at like CompUSA or something. And it allowed you to fill out different areas. It was just a glorified word processor with a lot of sections in it. And it had a lot of good financial calculations. And that's where I started realizing that I had not planned very well. So I filled out a lot of that stuff, and a lot of it was kind of pie in the sky stuff. You had to guess, well, where am I going to be at in 3 years? You really don't know. I've been in business now for, gosh, almost 30 years, and my plans change constantly. Maybe they shouldn't, it's hard to say, but you have to kind of go with the flow. Look what happened a few years ago. We had COVID hit. And of course, then your focus changes. So what you do may completely change, and then you got to go modify your business plan. But what a business plan is again, a best guess of what kind of money you're going to make in a year, what kind of money you're going to make in, say, 3 years or 5 years. So it's a kind of a roadmap that you would build, and much of it is financial. And the main reason a formal business plan, again, is necessary is because banks and other investors are going to require it. And I've got a question here. When you were starting out, how do you build a business plan after all you have no customers yet? That is going to be, again, a guess. You're going to have to estimate who your customers are going to be. So you're going to have a very good idea of what your business is going to be. Let me go from the standpoint of what I did. So for instance, I started out building control panels, and I had a good idea who my main targets would be for those control panels. So I said, okay, I'm going to build panels, and I'm going to guess that they cost, let's say, $5,000 for a small panel. Am I going to buy the product? How much am I going to mark the product up? That was always a good thing. And it was, anywhere from 15%, just kind of a handling fee for the products. And then how much labor is it going to take to do it? Am I going to hire somebody to do the labor or do it myself? If I do it myself, how many hours is it going to take? And then, so an Excel spreadsheet is a lot of where this comes from. How many hours is it going to take me to build this panel? Make an estimate if you haven't done it yet, right? It's just a kind of a wild guess. Hopefully, whatever you're going to do, you have some experience doing, so you have a good idea how long it takes to do certain things. But you're going to have to guess how much is this going to be worth? And then the toughest part is, how many panels am I going to build a month if I were building control panels? If I'm doing programming or design, how many design projects am I going to do in a month? And as you start getting to where, well, my capacity is to do, 4 panels a month, let's say 1 a week, and I'm an individual person, all of a sudden I get orders for 6 or 8 panels a month. I have to hire somebody. What is that person going to cost? And I'm going to mention in the next slide some of the extra costs for people. Right? There's not just the cost of the person, how many hours they spend, there are extra costs. So what you generally do is you'll come up with a kind of a weighted hour figure, and you'll say, as an example, let's say the panel building function makes $45 an hour for whoever does it, whether you do it or whether somebody else does it. I'm going to pay that person, say, $25 an hour. The extra Social Security that you have to pay, so I'll mention that in a minute. You do have to match Social Security. You'll take some out of their check, and then you will have to match that as a company. Even for yourself, you'll have to do that. That's part of it. Let's say you have medical insurance. That's part of it. You have overhead within your company, say secretaries or human resources people, the building itself, electricity, all those things. So that all adds up. So how much profit am I going to need to make to cover all those other things, plus the margin on each job to make, hopefully, the company a profit? All that is a guess. It's a wild guess. Got another question about insurance. I'm going to cover that in just a moment. So planning, licensing, permits, I am going to go through some of the costs of some of these things in insurance in just a moment. Licensing and permits, you do need, at the very least, you need a business license. Permits, that really depends on what you are. If you're an electrician, you would need an electrician's license, a contractor's license, general contractor. What's interesting is if you get into the automation world in the United States, there are really no permits required. If you want to go work in an industrial facility, if the facility will let you work there, then you can work there with no licensing. That's very interesting. You will need, at the very least, protection-wise, liability insurance. Most companies are going to require, back when I first started my first company, $1 million liability policy was basic. I want to say at the time I paid, and this was in the 90s, I paid probably $500 a year. It varies all over the place as far as the cost of insurance. So right now, I do individual work. Most of my customers don't require insurance, but occasionally they do. I just did work for Nissan. They required $2 million. I have a $2 million policy. That's where I max out at, but I wasn't doing any physical work. I was just teaching there and developing them some content, books and things. My liability insurance costs me $1,000 a year, I want to say, very close to that. There was a time at which it cost me $3,000 a year. And I looked around and talked to some other people and found, $1,000 a year through Farm Bureau. It was a pretty good deal. Would it differ depending on the legal body your company is? Yes, it gets bigger. Of course, S Corps and C Corps, they have a lot more employees. A lot of what they're going to base the insurance on, and there's going to be all kinds of exclusions, is what you do, right? If you build custom machinery, if your machine catches on fire and burns the plant down, you're going to have a bigger policy. You're going to have a bigger liability policy. As you hire people, they are going to require workman's comp. And that's another cost, right? And I don't remember what we paid for that. My last company, again, I started it in 96, ended it in 2006, and we grew to about 15 employees. And workman's comp was a pretty significant payment. And then if somebody claimed on you workman's comp, and this happened once, I had a welder, and it turned out he actually came in, and when he applied, he had a cast on his leg, and he worked for a while and then kind of stopped showing up. And then we got a workman's comp claim. And he said he injured himself while he was at our place, and we had to kind of go fight it. We said that, the guy came in and interviewed with a cast on and just stopped showing up. We didn't fire him or anything else. He just stopped showing up, and he wasn't hurt here welding or doing anything else. So we fought it a little bit, and still our workman's comp went up. Liability went up as we grew in size. So that got reevaluated every year. And if you started doing something, so when I started out, I was building control panels and doing a little programming. After about 5 or 6 years, we started building machinery. And that increased our liability insurance quite a bit. You also had things like the building. You had to insure contents of the building. You had to insure your equipment. If you leased equipment, you had to insure that. That would be required by the person that owned the equipment until you paid it off, right? So they wanted their things covered. So that's another thing to think about, protection-wise, insurance-wise. Other things to think about: finances, keeping records, right? So I was going to show a little bit of how I keep records. This is on a different page, so let me bring this up. And I've done this for a long time. And I used to have QuickBooks and used to have something called Peachtree. I can only show part of this, so this is kind of interesting. But all these tabs down here at the bottom are different records that I have to keep. This particular spreadsheet I started when I restarted my business in 2012. So you can see a lot of different tabs here. This one I can't really show you because it has a lot of my financial information on it. This one, same thing. This I keep how much money is in each different account that I have related to the business. So me personally, I have a company account with my local Wilson County Bank. I have a expense account with Bank of America, and I have a PayPal account. And that's because I do other kinds of business that aren't directly related to systems integration. I keep track of mileage. This is really important because this is a direct deduction. And the way this works, right, is I take the current mileage rate and I pay myself for any travel that I make that is business related. And since I'm spending a lot of time going to Automation NTH, I get to write off all that travel. I'm sort of a contractor there, even though I work just about full time. When I do training for Automation Training, which is a company out of Canada, I get to write all that off and I get to claim income from it. So you can see here, some months I have 1,000 miles of travel. If I go to Miami, I want to say that there's one of my Miami trips. I do that a lot. You know, you actually get to write off $1,000 worth of your expenses. Now, this is another decision you'd have to make. Do I want to basically own the company vehicle and then expense it, right? And anything that I spend money on, work on the engine, fix it, buy the vehicle itself. You don't get to write the whole vehicle off. You get to depreciate it, right? So you'll get to write some of it off the first year, a little more of it off the second year, et cetera, but you'll be able to write off all the expenses. So I choose not to do that. What I do is I charge mileage for everything I do, and I write off everything I do, and I generally charge the customer. So this money right here goes directly to on the invoice to American Beverage Depot. And if I wanted to, I could even mark that up. Some companies like NTH, I'll get a per diem if I go on the road, and that does not have to be claimed. So that's kind of handy. So you can see a lot of different records here. I do a lot of driving, sometimes, you know, $1,400 miles a month. Just depends on what I'm doing at any given time. I write books, so I have income related to books, right? I have PayPal things that I do the membership site, the Automation Academy itself. I also have things on Udemy. Those don't pay a lot, right? But they probably pay for themselves. I have to forecast things. I have to make guesses on taxes. You have to make an estimated payment every quarter, sometimes every month. We used to have to make a payment every month for taxes. And that would be based on the income for that month, so that at the end of the year, you have all your taxes paid, and then you'll file, and you may get some money back, or you may have to pay, just like you do your personal taxes. Another thing that I started doing a long time ago, and these are all, I keep track of my paid jobs on a calendar, and I put the calendar in Excel. So the nice thing about this is it's not dependent on something like Outlook. And I can go back to, let's see what year this was, 2016, and I can tell what I was doing in a particular week, right? And I have them kind of color code for different things, different places. This was like a trade show here, so that's in a different color. This was ABD. This was a lot of this was automation training classes. You can see I can scroll through here pretty quickly, and you can see things like, let's see, this was, where was the tornado? There was a period where I didn't have many jobs, right? So there'll be big empty spaces. Or if I'm working on things like my books, there'll be big empty spaces in there, right? So that was another thing that I kept track of. Address and phone numbers. I started keeping those. A lot of these are either distributors or people that, I have to bill or things like that. Training. I'm not sure what all this is. Business tax list. This is a good one. So here's an idea of what I pay typically for different taxes and things. Personal property tax, right? I bought an old house to replace my old office, and I've been having to pay property taxes on that every year. You have personally property taxes on the contents of the house. If you buy something for a job, you will have to pay personal tax on anything that you own that has not gone into the job yet. That's rather interesting. So that's basically inventory. I'm going to talk here in a minute about the different kinds of automation jobs, but if you're a distributor, you're going to pay for the material that you have in stock. So that's an extra cost that you need to keep track of. So finances, like lots of records here. What I do with my CPA, I have a certified public accountant that I've hired. I don't necessarily recommend doing this at the beginning because it's not cheap, but they will go through and figure out, what your estimated taxes are. I deal with him probably 3 or 4 times a year. Whenever all of those taxes that I showed you before are due, he will file those for me. City of Lebanon, Wilson County, state of Tennessee. I think I fill out my own LLC report, but he does a lot of that other stuff for me. And he keeps track of things like depreciating assets. Interestingly, this house that I use as my office is a depreciating asset. And I paid cash for it, but I pulled it out of a brokerage account to pay for it. And then I'm paying the brokerage account back. I thought at first, oh, maybe I can expense this whole thing. No, it's just like a car or anything else, it depreciates. Computers, same thing. If you buy a computer, you do not get to write the entire thing off the first year, it depreciates. And there's a schedule for all those. So any equipment that you own, there'll be a depreciation schedule. The first iteration of this company, I had a mill and a lathe and an iron worker and welders and lots of panel building equipment, machine building equipment, had to keep track of all that inventory. We would do inventory, I believe, in September and figure out what all we had in stock for all the jobs that we were doing, things like that. And the equipment, some of it we owned, some of it we leased. So some of it had to be insured, and I had to keep track of all that. That was important also. So keeping track of your finances, like I said, mine's a dual purpose thing. I have the spreadsheet, and then I take pages out of the spreadsheet and turn it over to the CPA, and he puts it in the formal document for my tax returns every year. Other things to think about, and this kind of goes with some advice that I'm gonna give here at the very end. Human resources and people. I hired too early. I always said I probably should have stayed in my garage for about another 6 months, and I would have been in good shape, and probably waited an equal amount of time to hire somebody. At the same time, if you're working out of your garage, do you want to hire somebody and have them in your garage? That's questionable, right? So you would probably have to get your facility. And does that interrupt? You're really busy if you're growing fast enough that you have to have an office or something. So now all of a sudden you're having to move all your stuff into the office and set that up at the same time as doing the work, at the same time as hiring somebody. So balancing all that is really tough. but that is a requirement if you are going to hire people, right? You are human resources. And I started out, I hired one guy part-time. He went full-time in a couple months. And then I hired another guy. And then I brought my wife into the business. She learned how to build control panels and helped me a lot. And then she started taking over human resources and hiring people. We would both talk to the people. Then as I got engineers and I hired more engineers, those engineers would help me interview new engineers. So that was all took time out from the people that were doing that work. Took time out from me, took time out from my wife, whatever. So that's considered overhead, right? If you're doing that work on the side, if you're working 40 hours a week doing one thing, you're probably doing another 20 hours a week doing stuff like that and paperwork. So that's an extra time consuming thing that you're going to need to think about. And how are you going to qualify the people that you hire? That's another really important question. This last one may be one of the most important ones. How do you get your customers? And I'm going to bring this up later. I think in my tips and tricks, I mentioned networking. Interestingly, in 1996, which was when I started that business, I decided to send out 1,000 flyers. And at that time, I had worked for two controls companies and knew where all the factories were. And then I bought something called the Manufacturer's Guide, and it had a list of every large, company, every company probably over a few people in Tennessee. And I made a list of those, and I got addresses and people's names, and I sent out 1,000 flyers. It cost me quite a bit, took a long time to, print all the labels and things like that. And I got exactly 0 responses. So sending flyers out, at the time, we didn't have the internet, so you couldn't create a web page, right? 96, this was Windows 95 era. So I thought this was probably the best way to expose myself to different customers and things. And I got exactly 0 responses from all the flyers that I sent out. Never got a phone call, never got, I don't remember, I don't think we had a lot in the way of email back then, but never got any kind of a response at all. So I realized very quickly at that time that everything was networking. That particular business, when I started, I had 4 jobs. And as I mentioned, I was working out of my garage, and I kind of transitioned out of this. I worked for the Allen Bradley distributor at the time, but I was a technical specialist who was supposed to make some commission. Like I said, I kind of got upset with them and left, just jumped out on the business. I had thought about it for a while, but a lot of my customers ended up being companies that I had called on in sales or done business with. You have to be very careful about that also, because if you were in direct competition, companies will have you sign a non-compete agreement. Well, I wasn't competing with the Allen Bradley vendor. Obviously, I'm not selling Allen Bradley parts or any other parts. I was doing control panel building and simple programming at the time. So it didn't breach any non-competes or anything like that. But all of my jobs came from people that I already knew. They weren't new customers or anything else. At the time, it was had a job for a company called Fortifil Fibers. I built them a bunch of control enclosures and did some simple programming where all we were doing is counting spools of material. And whenever they would take a spool off, I would reset the counter to 0, and then I would keep counting every time it made a revolution. I would count 1 revolution, and eventually, okay, this spool is about to be wound. Alert the person to come over and take the spool off and put a new spool on there, and just keep track of everything. So that took a whole lot of panels and things like that. That customer I had known through the Allen Bradley distributor. Another customer was a Japanese company. It was a manufacturing company that made compressors, and I had called on them with the company that I worked for before working for the Allen Bradley distributor. And the way that I got that business is they said, we're all Omron in this plant. We don't use Allen Bradley. but we have this problem over here, and we have this other problem over here. One of them was that they had presses, and they would get these little slugs. They would punch things out of material, and the slugs would fall on a conveyor underneath the press. And occasionally the slugs would all get stuck. And so they wanted to know, is the conveyor emptying slugs out, or has it stalled, right? Has it jammed up because slugs got stuck in the belt or whatever? So again, a simple program and a control panel to count these slugs coming out and make sure that the conveyor was turning, and that every time the press cycled that something came out of it, right? Wasn't real high tech or anything. So that was another customer. A third customer, I built a bunch of plastic enclosures for. Like I said, I would take any kind of work that I could, and learned how to do plexiglass enclosures, and it had nothing to do with technology. Interestingly, this was a subsidiary of Alcoa, and I got a lot of business later by starting out and solving one of their problems. So networking is everything. Got to know the engineers there, and they started trusting me with bigger and bigger projects. And as I got better and better at programming, learning with my partner that I had teamed up with a machine builder at the time, they started trusting me with bigger and bigger projects. And about 6 years into it, they let me start building their machinery for them. So that became very valuable, the networking. So I had overall, probably all 10 years I was doing work for that subsidiary. But I guess my point to make here on sales is, where does your business come from? Probably almost entirely from people you already know. Nowadays, we have the internet, which is really powerful. You can get to know people on platforms like LinkedIn, other resources. I've got my IO Central here that trying to get people to network on there, connect with other business owners, right? Even if they're not in your business, get to know people in other fields. And sometimes what'll happen is, some job will come up somewhere and somebody will refer somebody to you. Obviously, for big machinery, things like that, that's probably not likely. You're going to start out with small, little, simple jobs that people can trust you with. But as they get to trust you more, you build a relationship. Everything is relationships, in my opinion. Now, that being said, I have picked up training jobs off of LinkedIn. That's a kind of a low risk thing, right? If you've got a decent reputation, you can go in and teach somebody something, and it doesn't cost anything other than the training cost for something. So small things are pretty easy to land, but big things like machines or big projects, people are putting a lot of trust in you. So they're going to want to get to know you first. So those are all some things to think about. Advantages and disadvantages of starting a business. Obviously, I mentioned before, you can deduct expenses for pretty much everything. Use of your home. You can take a percentage if you have a home office, and you get to take that as a deduction, from your cost. That's your office cost. I don't do that. I've always, rented a building, or in this case, I own the building. But then you can deduct your rent, whatever you're paying. If you're paying bills, you can deduct that. As I mentioned, because I bought this house, I thought I could deduct the thing as an expense the first year, and I really can't. It's every year they take a certain amount off, and that counts as your expenses. So that's a positive, right? Mileage, home use, any of your expenses are covered. Food, right? That's interesting. When I'm on the road, I get to deduct my food and my hotel, lodging, things like that. So I get to eat for free quite a bit. Sometimes I charge that to the customer. Sometimes I simply deduct it myself from the job, and I charge enough to make sure that my food and my expenses are covered. That's a positive. A negative, I mentioned this before, company match of Social Security. If you hire somebody, you're going to have to match the Social Security payments. So 6.25% is taken out of the person's paycheck, but then an extra 6.25% gets paid by the company. This can add up, right? 6.25 of whatever you pay the person for a year. If that's a $100,000 person, then that's $6,200 a year additional expense on that person. If you have medical insurance, that's an extra expense. Workman's compensation, that's an extra expense. That's basically insurance, right? Workman's comp is insurance. And once you get signed up for workman's comp, it's very hard to get rid of it. Even if you start getting rid of employees, I'm down to one person now, just me. It's an agreement I made with my wife when I restarted my company. But even then, the old workman's comp company would come after me and say, you need workman's comp insurance. And I'm like, no, I don't. It's just me. And often customers will ask you, do you have workman's comp on your people? And you'll have to say yes or no. If you're a sole proprietorship, I'm an LLC, but I act as a sole proprietorship. Most of the time I can get away with saying, I don't need it. I'm not required by law to have it. Pay your own benefits, medical insurance, that's a negative. So these are supposed to be little minus signs here. Control of time. This is interesting. Is this an advantage or a disadvantage? I'm going to go back here and show these statistics from the beginning of this discussion. 70% of Americans say they would like to own a business. 6% of Americans actually own one. The main reason is that people wanted to own a business was flexibility of time and control over your income. Well, that's very interesting. Is that a positive or a negative? Yes, you control your time. I did 10 years in that first company, and I made my daughters were involved in sports activities, and I was able to make most of their major activities. My oldest was a gymnast, and I went to her gymnastics meets, most of them on the weekends. But I also missed a lot of their other activities, right? I worked every weekend, just about, other than when I was on the road, on vacation or something. I worked every weekend. That actually caused some conflict between me and my wife. She was like, well, you're always gone. And it was like, well, actually the weekend is my time to get things done that I didn't get done during the week, right? During the week, I'm selling and I'm doing the actual work. I was programming, I was supervising people, whatever. So the weekends were kind of peaceful. Sometimes other people had to work on the weekends too, but weekends were when I could do my record keeping, my planning for the next week, just thinking or whatever, my filling out my spreadsheet, keeping records for things. So all my time was taken up. In retrospect, I don't recommend that. I would say, if you're a churchgoer, you need to, make time for your church, maybe take Sunday off every week or something. And I do that now. I take one day just about fully off. Now, oddly enough, today is that day. Am I taking it fully off? Well, I'm doing this webinar in the morning. This is every 2 or 3 weeks. But tomorrow I will be in here doing the work that I can't get done during the week. Filling out a lot of things, doing some research. I'm doing a lot of work on Beckoff right now, and have to do some of that on my own time. Nobody's paying me for that. So that's can be a plus or a minus. More income, that's relative also. I guarantee you on my first business, I did not really make more income than probably I would have working for somebody else. But also, I didn't have the qualifications to work for a large custom machine builder like I have now done in the past. I didn't know enough about it. So I jumped out on my own and kind of winged it. Automation related businesses. How are we doing on time? Pretty good. These are all things that you can think about. If you are in the automation space, where I started out, I would say even my first business, it was kind of contracting. It was contracting control panel building and programming on a small scale in '96. But then pretty quickly I got into, like I said, an office, and I was no longer contracting. I was actually building equipment. But when I restarted my business, I worked for Wright Industries from 2006 to the end of 2011. And immediately when I jumped out, I did get a small office. It was one of these rental office places where you got a single 10 by 10 room. I put a desk in there, and I started contracting to a company that you've probably heard me mention on here before. And their logo, as a matter of fact, on the first page, let's see, Automation NTH. So I contracted to them in 2012. That was my first thing. That's one of the easiest jobs to get. So if you wanted to start your own contracting business, you just use the contacts you've got, go to those big machine builders and see if they have room for you to come in and do a little programming or contract work building control panels or something like that. Automation NTH right now, I believe, has 4 electricians contracted because they have extra work in their panel shop. So if you're an electrician and you want to get into automation related businesses, go to those businesses and see if they have a little bit of overflow work that they can farm out to you. Some of that work can be done basically from home, right? If you're doing programming, I think they're gonna say, well, we'll contract you for 40 hours a week to do programming for us, and we expect this result after a couple months, and then you'll go start up the machine. I did that myself, and it did not work very well when I contracted someone. I contracted somebody in about 1999 or 2000 because I didn't know Siemens very well. So I hired a Siemens guy to do some programming for me. And then I would, bring him in and say, well, what have you done? And by the way, I'd like to, learn a little bit about Siemens as we go through it. And the guy would submit, I think, 40 hours a week. And my wife sometimes, as the human resource person, would call, and he was almost always, every time she called during the day, doing something else, right? So you could tell that there was a lot of noise in the background and various things going on. And I wasn't totally satisfied with the work he did. So I learned my lesson. I learned Siemens myself right at that time. That was about 1999, which was my first Siemens job. In retrospect, I would rather learn how to do whatever that person's doing. And if you're going to contract somebody, you might want to have them in person where you can kind of make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do. So give them some shared office space or whatever, and they can sit in that office and work on whatever they're doing. So that's what I do with Automation NTH. My agreement with them is I do 2 weeks a month right now, totally flexible. And they said I can do 1 week in their facility, right? I actually have a cube in there and do my training development work in there, or I teach classes, mentor people, or I can work 1 week a month out of town if I want to. I haven't taken them up on that. I've actually enjoyed sitting in their facility and kind of like doing contracting again. I just sit in the cube and I enjoy the camaraderie of other people, but I have a lot of flexibility there. So that's the way contracting works anyway. You make an agreed rate and they pay you that rate, constant amount every month or every week or every hour, whatever it is, and you bill them regularly. Automation products. I know a lot of people that do this. The one that comes to mind right now is a guy I went to school with. His name is Brandon Ellis. You can find him on LinkedIn, and he started a company called Elitech. Elitech both reps products, right? Representing products means you don't stock the product yourself, but you help other distributors, or maybe they don't have distribution and you go in and do technical assistance on technical products into the end users, into the customers. So that's the way manufacturers' reps work. Some of them call on other distributors. They're the technical support for the distributors, and some of them just cover a region and they have a collection of products that they represent, usually technical products. So in other words, they end up having a team of sales engineers working as a manufacturer's rep. Charles Ashby Company, they rep Hoffman for our area, and they call on the Allen Bradley distributors, Stuart Irby, other distributors, and they represent the Hoffman enclosures. I think they represent other things like Grace ports. Manufacturers reps don't usually represent things like PLCs. That's more of a distribution thing. I'd say there's some exceptions to that. And then there is systems integration, and some of these product vendors, right, that are manufacturers, reps, or distributors will actually do systems integration. Company that comes to mind there was Brazelco. Brazelco would build machines for people, build control panels for people at the same time as being a distributor for certain products. I think Elitech does a certain amount of that right now. Usually that systems integration will be limited to whatever product they handle. So I think Elitech does Siemens right now, so I assume they do systems integration using Siemens. Do they do things like Allen Bradley? I couldn't tell you that. Probably not. Distributors rarely do that, but I will say there's a company here called Bertelkamp, and Bertelkamp recently has started doing that. Distributor that builds control panels and does systems integration. This becomes a problem because you may be, as a distributor, competing with your systems integrator customers. So they don't like that necessarily. Same thing with machine building customers. If Bertelkamp is building machines, they are taking work away from some of the machine builders. That doesn't mean they're going to lose their large machine builder customers, because they don't care, right? They're not going to build the smaller machines that some of these distributors build. So you're not competing with the large ones like the JR Automations, Wright Industries, things like that. Services. There are people I've met really just through LinkedIn. I think Nikki Gonzalez is one of them. And she, I think, finds products for people. So that's an interesting idea. You can provide a service and hook people up with products, or let's say recruiting. I would say recruiting service, right? Finding technical people to do certain jobs, finding resources. That would be a service that you could provide that's automation related. Training. I do a lot of that. I do in-person training. I do recorded training. I do a lot of custom training. A lot of the training I do, people will, let's say they have a project and somebody will hire me to teach them a platform. I've done webinars with a couple of these people. One of them in particular did not know PLCs at all, but he wanted to build a dust collection unit. He was the vice president of the company. He was going to law school at the same time, and he wanted to build his own dust collector. They had always contracted out all the, I think they did some of the mechanical and sheet metal work themselves, but they contracted out the controls. Well, what was interesting about that was he came in and thought he wanted to learn PLC programming, and it turned out we spent much more time on designing the panel. And so I did a lot of electrical design training for him, sizing of things, showing him where the resources were to buy the products that we, why do we spec this product for this particular project? So we spent, I think, 2 hours on the programming training, and we spent most of a week on the rest of it. Fortunately, he already knew AutoCAD, so he was quite good at CAD. I gave him a lot of examples, and he was able to create his own entire electrical drawing set, and they were really quite good, considering that, again, he had never done this before. But he did a lot of research himself online, got lots of examples, and then I helped him a little bit with the PLC program, but honestly, it wasn't much. It was you just turned on a big fan, and every once in a while cycled a trash compactor. Very simple project overall, but I do that kind of training. So I've had a few people that have wanted to write a certain kind of program, and I'll actually sit down and help them write the program as a training exercise. Other training that you can do, this is a little more difficult and expensive. Some of you know I teach for automation training out of Canada. They're basically a logistics company. So they ship trainers with PLCs in them, and they ship computers around the country. As an instructor, I go meet that equipment in a hotel, teach the class, ship all that equipment back either to Canada or to my own facility. I use their material when I'm teaching those classes. That's difficult to do. If you're going to do training, you better have kind of canned material, and it's probably going to be a generic class for their type of training. So for instance, there's a control logics modules 1 through 4. one module per day, everybody gets the same product. Siemens 1 through 4, same thing. Siemens 5 through 8, Allen Bradley 5 through 8. It's not even an advanced programming class. It's a advanced instruction set class. So we explain what the advanced instruction set does. And that kind of training is all instruction set training. I don't think there's anybody out there that's teaching actually how to program. I do that. I do teach programming particularly. The main reason for this is if you have 4 or 5 people in a class, it's very rare that they all want to learn the exact same thing or that they're all at the same level. So training is tricky, but hands-on, hand in hand with that for training is in person, going into a plant and working with the maintenance people. I've got one customer that does that once a year. Basically, I go in and every day I'll work with different people. I go out on the line, we work with the equipment. I started out just doing Siemens training for them. They already knew Allen Bradley. And later on, they said, we want you to come in and just work with our maintenance people and see where their problems are. That is definitely, I think, a good avenue to go. You can basically contract doing that. Go into some of these larger companies because people have training budgets. Companies definitely have those. Passive income. Lots of folks that do this, people who do online training, right? If you have training videos, websites, books, videos, those are possibilities. My Automation Academy provides some, it basically pays for itself. It's something that has a lot of potential. I have a lot of material on there, but it requires quite a bit of marketing. That's one of the downsides to websites. Websites are something that takes a lot of marketing. I'll refer there to Solus PLC and the automation blog, the automation shop, the automation school, which is Sean Tierney's thing. A lot of those websites are tied into corporate accounts. So they have signed factories on to basically license their products. Writing books. This can create passive income. You will probably never make back what you put into a book. It takes 4 to 6 months of pretty constant time to write a book on just about anything. And that 4 to 6 months is spread out sometimes over a year, year and a half. But I put probably maybe up to 1,000 hours into a book. And at my working rate, that's a lot more than I make. 1,000 hours times my working rate. I will probably never make that back on books. However, if you couple that with training, right? If you generate your own material and then you use it for training, it kind of gets made up for by the hourly cost of the training. So these are all ideas. Anybody who needs to know more about these, I've kind of done a piece of all of them and can probably give you some insight outside of this webinar. Tips and tricks. So this is kind of the last thing that I wanted to cover here. First off, I say in general, and again, I listen to Dave Ramsey's show and the Ken Coleman show and a lot of this in the morning, but it's not only for that reason. I have personal experience with this. Don't borrow money to start a business. I mentioned in this third one here, start small, do a side hustle, buy the equipment that you need, as you need it. You're going to need things like, let's say you're doing control panel building. You're going to need things like a jigsaw and a drill and some hand tools, some punches. Go buy those with your Christmas money or whatever. Pay cash for them. Don't go borrow money for big equipment. You really don't know what you need when you get started anyway. I've leased equipment in the past. I think that can be an okay idea. Sometimes it gets paid for on the side, but don't do what I did, which is basically my first year, I ran up credit cards to get into my office and to hire somebody and to buy equipment and things like that. And despite the fact that I grew the company to a couple $1,000,000 a year, I never paid off that initial amount. I had a line of credit with the bank and I refinanced, did various different things. But I want to say I ran up about $50,000 worth of debt. in the beginning, and I always floated on about $50,000 worth of debt for various things, buying equipment for customers. There are a lot of like standard rates when you build a machine for somebody. Our standard rate was 40, 40, 20. That's 40% down payment, 40% prior to shipment, and then 20% final. Well, you're buying a whole lot of parts, and those parts are probably 50% of the cost of the machine. So you're having to float some of the product. And there's always things like wire and who knows what, just normal office expenses. So you're always having things that you need to spend money on. Your better bet would be save, 6 months worth of your expenses ahead of time before you leave your current job. I would say that would be a big thing. And that goes hand in hand with planning, right? Prepare, figure out what you're going to need. If you can save up, I don't know, $50,000, $100,000 before you go out on your own and be completely debt-free otherwise, then you'll be a lot better prepared than I was, for instance. Despite the fact that I built the company into a decent little company, but like I said, really, I don't consider it successful because it really never made what I would call a large profit. It seemed like we were handling a lot of money. We built, several $100 machines and things, and I never went out and bought BMWs or things like that, but I just always seemed to be riding debt. So I would just say avoid that if you can, because keep in mind, you will have to pay it back at some time, and you're going to pay interest, which is extra cost. So that's my number one tip and trick. Don't borrow money. To go with that, start small. Do it as a side hustle. I built control panels in my garage while I was still working for the distributor. In retrospect, wish I would have done that for 6 months. Little did I know. I started my company in June, and that September, I met my old he wasn't a partner, but he owned a machine building company. He'd started 2 months ahead of me, and I did all his controls work. Well, if I would have been in my garage at that time, I would have probably, not hired anybody, done the jobs that I did, and then gone in September and maybe moved into the facility next to his. So I spent 6 months paying for an office that honestly I didn't need. I probably didn't need the guy that was working for me part-time at that time. I just would have taken a little longer, had to work a little harder. So start small as a side hustle if you can, or if you're going to do it full-time, try to stay in your garage, work out of your house for a little while. Don't go get a fancy office and lots of office equipment, things like that. Find a mentor. Go talk to people who are in the type of business that you want to be in, and go talk to them and find out what they did to start, and form a good relationship with them, buy them coffee or lunch or whatever, and pick their brain on what they do and how they got started. Even if it's just a business mentor that can advise you on things and bounce ideas off of. Locate local and online resources. This goes hand in hand with the next thing, which is network. Local resources include things like distributors. Where are you going to get your products from that you're either going to resell or you're going to build into something? Interestingly, distributors and manufacturers reps are like the bumblebees of the integration world. Those are the people who can tell you what's going on in the different plants. So that goes hand in hand with the networking. Get to know your salespeople, treat them well, buy stuff from them. If they do a good job from electrical distributors, controls distributors, things like that, and you can use those resources to get an idea what's going on in the industry, who's doing what job. Get to know even your competitors. You can have friendly competition. Go find other integrators. One of the things I've done is put together a list of most of the integrators in Tennessee. And there's a couple reasons for this that I've talked to about in other webinars, but one is I work with the manufacturers. It's an entrepreneurial outreach that's run by the University of Tennessee in this state, but every state has one. Manufacturing Extension Partnership, that's what it is, MEP. Every state has an MEP. That networking, right, getting a list of those integrators and things the MEP in your area probably doesn't have a list of those integrators. So if you can provide that to them, they in turn may help you with some of your projects and things, introduce you around. And they have some facilities and things that that they can help you with. Track everything. Again, I go back to my spreadsheet. I track everything I do just about. I keep handwritten notes. I have notebooks for things, project notebooks, especially in technical fields. If you're doing project work, track everything that you do, everything that you buy, keep all your receipts, make lists, parts lists and things like that. What did this product cost? So that the next time you have to make an estimate on a job, you can pull up those spreadsheets and things, those resources, and use that to bid your jobs, right? Also, you will, how much money did I make on this job? How much money did I lose on this job? What did my hours take, right? My employees, how much time did they spend working on this particular job? How long did the programming take? How long did the panel building take? What did the products cost? All kinds of things. Track all that. You can do it by hand at first, and then enter it into something like an Excel spreadsheet. I've mentioned this before. I think an engineer's best friend is the Excel spreadsheet in most cases, more than your programming software. And that's definitely true for business owners. Excel is powerful. You can keep track of monetary things and lots of things there. So that's mostly it. For those of you who don't know about it, IO Central is the rebranded community part of the Automation Academy. And this is found here. It's still at automationllc.com, but go into community.automationllc.com. Or if you're a member of the Academy, just hit the IO Central tab up at the top. And this is, kind of a new thing, opening it to the public, but I do have a few folks that have jumped in there and made comments and things, and I do appreciate that. Next webinar will be November 26th. That is the weekend after Thanksgiving. Don't know what the topic will be. Anybody who has suggestions for topics, I am up for discussion, right, about that. Would love to have guests. I haven't had a guest in a while. I think it's very hard to coordinate schedules with a lot of people. So talked to Brennan Duggar again, had him on as a guest a few months ago, and he was in Las Vegas, so he wasn't able to appear. I try to get guests on here that are vendors for things like PLC Next, or would love to have a good Beckhoff guest. I'm spending a lot of time on Beckhoff right now. That's my latest thing, and I'll be putting a lot of that material in the Automation Academy. There's already some stuff there, but I've learned a lot about Beckhoff. It is a complicated bunch of stuff, and I'm running into a lot of library problems and things right now that I'm working with the Beckhoff folks up in Minnesota to get resolved. So I'm going to be sharing that with everybody if you ever get into Beckhoff systems integration. And of course, join the Automation Academy. We've got lots of material in there on mostly Allen Bradley and Siemens, a little bit of Omron, a little bit of Beckhoff. No recordings yet on it, but I do plan on making some videos for Beckhoff. I've built a trainer for it, and I'm working with a CX9020, learning a lot on it, and I'm about ready to put that on there. But thanks for those of you who show up. Looks like there's a few of you here in my list, and thanks for coming, and we'll see you the next time.